They're not angry because you failed. They're angry because you didn't. Everything they carefully avoided, manipulated, or suppressed has come back, louder, clearer, and completely out of their control. And what shocks them the most? You didn't break. You didn't chase. You changed. Main speech. There's something deeply misunderstood about avoidance. People think it is distance, they think it is silence, they think it is control. But avoidance is not control, it is fear wearing a mask of calm. When someone avoids truth, avoids responsibility, avoids emotional honesty, they begin to construct a reality that feels safe but isn't real, and the mind can only sustain illusion for so long. Because life does not negotiate with avoidance. It reveals, it exposes, it returns, and when it does not come gently. It comes as consequence. What they plotted, whether consciously or unconsciously, was not just distance from you, it was distance from themselves. And that distance creates distortion. They believed silence would weaken you. They believed absence would diminish you. They believed control would stabilize their world. But what they didn't understand is that growth does not depend on their permission. You stepped into something they could not. Responsibility, awareness, change, and that is what unsettles them. Because when someone who was expected to collapse evolves instead, it forces a confrontation. Not with you, but with their own unresolved reality. They are not shocked by your success. They are shocked by their own reflection in it. Everything they avoided, accountability, vulnerability, truth, is now standing in front of them, without distraction, and there is nowhere left to go. Avoidance always demands a cost, and that cost is clarity. But clarity, when delayed, does not arrive softly. It arrives as disruption. And that is what you are witnessing. Not revenge, not karma in the simplistic sense, but the natural unfolding of cause and effect. You did not cause their discomfort. You revealed it by no longer participating in the patterns that sustained it, and now they must face what they spent so long running from. Avoidance is often mistaken for strength because, on the surface, it can look like composure, restraint, or even wisdom. A person who walks away from conflict, who remains silent in emotionally charged situations, or who appears unaffected by tension, is frequently praised for being calm or in control. But beneath that surface, avoidance is rarely about clarity or conscious choice. More often, it is a deeply ingrained protective response, one that originates not from confidence, but from fear and unmet emotional needs that were never fully acknowledged or understood. At its core, avoidance is the nervous system's attempt to maintain safety. When a person has experienced emotional overwhelm, rejection, or instability, especially early in life, the mind learns to associate certain feelings or interactions with danger. Not physical danger, but psychological threat. The fear of being exposed, judged, abandoned, or hurt. Over time, instead of confronting these feelings, the individual learns to move away from them. They distract, they withdraw, they minimize, or they disconnect. And because this strategy often prevents immediate discomfort, it begins to feel like strength. But there is a difference between strength and suppression. Strength involves the capacity to face discomfort with awareness and resilience. Suppression, on the other hand, involves pushing discomfort out of conscious awareness altogether. Avoidance falls into the latter category. It is not that the person does not feel. It is that they have learned not to engage with what they feel. This disengagement creates a kind of emotional numbness or detachment that can be mistaken for stability, but in reality, it is a form of disconnection from oneself. The problem with avoidance is that what is not faced does not disappear. Emotions, unmet needs, and unresolved experiences do not dissolve simply because they are ignored. Instead, they remain active beneath the surface, influencing thoughts, behaviors, and relationships in subtle but powerful ways. A person who avoids conflict may also avoid intimacy because true closeness requires vulnerability. Someone who avoids difficult conversations may struggle with authenticity because honesty often brings discomfort. In this way, avoidance begins to shape a person's entire way of being, limiting their capacity to fully experience connection, growth, and meaning. What makes avoidance particularly complex is that it often develops as a necessary adaptation. It is not something people choose consciously. For many, it was once a form of survival. A child who learns that expressing emotion leads to rejection may stop expressing altogether. A person who experiences unpredictability may seek safety in control and distance. These patterns become internalized, forming automatic responses that persist into adulthood. So when we speak about avoidance, it is important to understand that it is not a flaw in character. It is a reflection of past experiences that have not yet been integrated. However, while avoidance may have once served a purpose, it becomes limiting when it is no longer adaptive. The very strategy that once provided safety begins to create new forms of suffering. Relationships feel shallow or strained. Opportunities for growth are missed. There is a persistent sense of something being off, even if it cannot be clearly identified. This is because avoidance prevents a person from engaging with the very experiences that are necessary for healing and development. True strength lies not in the absence of discomfort, but in the willingness to face it. It involves turning toward what is difficult rather than away from it. This does not mean forcing oneself into overwhelming situations, but rather developing the capacity to stay present with one's internal experience, to notice emotions, to name them, and to understand their origins. It requires patience, compassion, and a recognition that vulnerability is not weakness, but a gateway to authenticity. When a person begins to move out of avoidance, they often encounter the very feelings they have spent years trying to escape. This can be unsettling, even frightening, but it is also the beginning of something profoundly transformative. By allowing these experiences to surface, they can be processed, understood, and eventually integrated. What was once a source of fear becomes a source of insight. What was once avoided becomes a pathway to deeper connection with oneself and with others. In this sense, avoidance is not strength, it is a signal. It points to areas of life where there is unresolved pain, unmet need, or unacknowledged fear. And within that signal lies an opportunity, not to judge oneself, but to become curious, not to suppress, but to understand. Because real strength is not about maintaining an appearance of control. It is about developing the inner capacity to face reality as it is with honesty and courage. If this resonates, do not ignore it. Subscribe now for deeper psychological clarity. Commit to your awareness, starting today, and share this with someone who needs to see it. Closing. You see, true power is not in control over others. It is in no longer needing to control anything at all. And when you reach that place, those who built their world on avoidance will always be shocked by your peace. When people suppress the truth, whether it is emotional truth, relational truth, or personal responsibility, they often believe they are maintaining order. Suppression can feel like control because it delays confrontation. It creates the illusion that by not addressing something, it will somehow lose its power or fade into the background. But truth does not operate that way. Truth, especially psychological truth, is not passive. It is active, persistent, and deeply woven into the fabric of our experience. And when it is denied, it does not disappear, it waits. This waiting is not neutral. Beneath conscious awareness, what is suppressed continues to shape perception, behavior, and emotional responses. A person may convince themselves that they have moved on, that something doesn't matter anymore, or that they are unaffected, yet their reactions tell a different story. There may be irritation where there should be calm, distance where there should be connection, or defensiveness where there should be openness. These are not random occurrences. They are signals, expressions of truths that have not been allowed into conscious awareness. The mind has a remarkable capacity to construct narratives that protect us from discomfort. It reframes events, justifies actions, and minimizes impact. This is not deception in a malicious sense. It is a protective mechanism. When facing the full reality of a situation feels overwhelming, the mind steps in to soften or distort it. But this distortion comes at a cost. It creates a split between what is real and what is acknowledged. And maintaining that split requires ongoing effort. Over time, this effort becomes unsustainable. Reality has a way of asserting itself, often in ways that cannot be ignored. What was once subtle becomes obvious. What was once internal begins to manifest externally. Relationships become strained, patterns repeat, opportunities are lost, or emotional states intensify. This is not coincidence. It is the natural consequence of living out of alignment with truth. When truth finally surfaces, it often does so abruptly, not because it is inherently harsh, but because it has been delayed for so long. The longer something is suppressed, the more forcefully it tends to emerge. This can feel like being blindsided, even though the signs were present all along. The shock comes not from the truth itself, but from the sudden removal of the illusion that kept it hidden. This moment of confrontation can be deeply destabilizing. The narratives that once provided a sense of safety begin to unravel. Certainty is replaced with doubt, control gives way to vulnerability, and the individual is faced with a choice: to continue resisting or to begin acknowledging what is real. This is often the most difficult point because it requires letting go of the very strategies that have been relied upon for stability. Yet within this disruption lies an opportunity. When truth emerges, it brings clarity, and clarity, while uncomfortable at first, is the foundation for meaningful change. It allows a person to see patterns that were previously invisible, to understand the impact of their actions, and to recognize the underlying emotions that have been driving their behavior. Without this awareness, growth is limited. With it, transformation becomes possible. It is important to understand that the return of truth is not a punishment. It is not something being done to a person. It is a natural process, a rebalancing. When something is out of alignment, there is an inherent movement toward correction. This movement can feel disruptive, but it is ultimately restorative. It brings the individual back into contact with reality, which is the only place from which authentic decisions can be made. Avoiding truth often stems from fear. Fear of being wrong, of being judged, of losing control, or of facing painful emotions. These fears are valid in the sense that they are real experiences within the individual, but avoiding them does not eliminate them. In fact, it tends to amplify them over time. What is not faced grows in the shadows, gaining strength through neglect. Facing truth, on the other hand, requires courage. It involves acknowledging not only external realities, but also internal ones, feelings, motivations, and contradictions. This process can be uncomfortable, even painful, but it is also liberating. When truth is acknowledged, the energy that was previously used to suppress it becomes available for growth, connection, and creativity. In the end, reality is not something that can be permanently avoided. It is patient, but it is also persistent. It does not demand immediate recognition, but it inevitably reveals itself, and when it does, it offers a choice: to continue resisting and remain stuck in patterns of avoidance, or to engage with what is real and begin the process of change. The shock that comes when suppressed truth returns is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that something long denied is finally being seen. And in that moment of seeing, there is the potential for a different way of being, one that is grounded not in illusion, but in awareness. Control-based behavior often appears organized, deliberate, and even effective on the surface. It gives the impression of someone who knows what they are doing, someone who is managing outcomes, anticipating risks, and staying ahead of uncertainty. But when that control is built on denial, on the refusal to acknowledge internal realities, emotional truths, or relational dynamics, it becomes fragile. It may function for a time, sometimes even for years, but it is not stable. It is constructed on a foundation that cannot hold under sustained pressure. At the core of control-based behavior is an attempt to regulate discomfort. When a person feels uncertain, vulnerable, or emotionally exposed, control offers a way to restore a sense of safety. This can take many forms: controlling conversations, controlling narratives, controlling how others perceive them, or even controlling their own emotional expression. By narrowing the range of possible outcomes, the individual reduces unpredictability. And for a nervous system that associates unpredictability with danger, this can feel necessary. However, when this need for control is rooted in denial, it is not aligned with reality. Denial involves rejecting or minimizing aspects of experience that are too uncomfortable to face. This might include denying one's own emotional needs, denying the impact of one's behavior on others, or denying the complexity of a situation. In doing so, the individual creates a simplified version of reality, one that is easier to manage but ultimately inaccurate. This inaccuracy is where the instability begins. Control relies on accurate information to be effective. When key elements of reality are excluded, the system of control becomes misinformed. Decisions are made based on incomplete or distorted understanding. Interactions are shaped by assumptions rather than awareness, and over time, this gap between perception and reality widens. Initially, this may not be obvious. The person may still achieve certain outcomes, maintain certain appearances, or avoid certain conflicts. But beneath the surface, tension accumulates. Relationships may begin to feel strained or transactional. Others may sense a lack of authenticity or openness. There may be recurring patterns that do not resolve, despite repeated efforts to manage them. These are early signs that the system of control is not functioning as intended. As this tension builds, the effort required to maintain control increases. More energy is needed to uphold the narrative, to manage perceptions, and to suppress contradictions. This can lead to rigidity. The person becomes less flexible, less open to feedback, and more defensive when confronted with anything that challenges their constructed reality. What once felt like control begins to feel like pressure. Eventually, something gives. It may be a relationship that breaks down, a situation that cannot be managed, or an internal state that becomes too intense to ignore. When this happens, the illusion of control collapses, and because it was built on denial, there is often very little to support the individual in that moment. The structures they relied on no longer function, and the realities they avoided begin to surface all at once. This collapse can feel sudden, but it is rarely without warning. The signs were present, often for a long time, but they were dismissed or minimized. The shock comes from the contrast between the perceived stability and the actual instability that was always there. It is the realization that what felt secure was, in fact, precarious. It is important to understand that the issue is not control itself. The ability to influence one's environment, to make decisions, and to create structure is not inherently problematic. In fact, these are essential aspects of functioning. The problem arises when control is used as a substitute for awareness, when it becomes a way to avoid engaging with reality rather than a tool to navigate it. True stability does not come from controlling everything. It comes from the capacity to respond to what is, rather than what one wishes were true. This requires a willingness to acknowledge uncertainty, to tolerate discomfort, and to remain open to information that challenges one's assumptions. It involves shifting from a rigid defensive stance to a more flexible and responsive one. When control is grounded in awareness rather than denial, it becomes adaptive. It can adjust to new information, accommodate complexity, and support meaningful interaction. It is no longer about maintaining a fixed image or outcome, but about engaging with reality in a way that is both effective and authentic. The collapse of control-based behavior built on denial is not the end of stability. It is the beginning of a different kind, one that is not dependent on illusion, but rooted in clarity. It may feel disorienting at first because it requires letting go of familiar strategies, but it also opens the possibility for a more grounded and sustainable way of being. In this sense, the breakdown is not a failure. It is a correction. It reveals the limitations of a system that could not hold, and it creates space for something more aligned with reality to emerge. Emotional avoidance does not occur in isolation. It may begin as an internal strategy, something a person does within themselves to manage discomfort, but it inevitably extends outward, shaping interactions, decisions, and relationships. What starts as a private coping mechanism gradually becomes a pattern that influences how a person shows up in the world. And because these patterns are often unconscious, the consequences they create can feel unexpected, even confusing. Yet they are not random. They are the natural extensions of what has been consistently avoided. When a person avoids their emotions, they are not simply choosing not to feel. They are interrupting a process. Emotions are signals. They carry information about needs, boundaries, values, and experiences. When these signals are ignored, the information does not vanish, it becomes distorted. Instead of being processed and understood, it leaks out in indirect ways. Irritation may replace sadness. Withdrawal may replace fear. Control may replace vulnerability. The original emotion is still present, but it is no longer expressed in a way that can be recognized or addressed. This distortion affects communication. A person who is not in touch with their own emotional state cannot fully articulate what they need or what they are experiencing. This leads to misunderstandings. Others may feel confused, dismissed, or even blamed without fully understanding why. Over time, this creates tension. Relationships begin to carry an undercurrent of unresolved emotion, things that were felt but never expressed, needs that were present but never acknowledged. As these patterns repeat, they begin to form cycles. For example, someone who avoids conflict may consistently withdraw when tension arises. This withdrawal may leave the other person feeling unheard or abandoned, prompting them to push harder for engagement. The increased pressure then reinforces the original person's need to withdraw, and the cycle continues. Neither person may fully understand the dynamic, but both feel its effects. What began as emotional avoidance in one individual has now become a relational pattern affecting both. These cycles do not remain contained. They ripple outward, influencing not just one relationship, but many. A person who avoids vulnerability in one context is likely to do so in others. This can lead to a broader sense of disconnection, a feeling that relationships lack depth or authenticity. There may be a longing for closeness, but also a simultaneous resistance to the very experiences that create it. This internal conflict can be difficult to recognize because the avoidance itself prevents full awareness of what is being resisted. Over time, the consequences of emotional avoidance accumulate. They may appear as recurring relationship difficulties, missed opportunities for connection, or a persistent sense of dissatisfaction. There may be patterns of choosing unavailable partners or of disengaging when things become meaningful. These outcomes can feel like external problems, but they are often rooted in internal dynamics that have not been addressed. What makes this process particularly challenging is that the individual may not see the connection between their avoidance and the outcomes they are experiencing. Because the avoidance is often automatic, it does not feel like a choice. It feels like a natural response. As a result, the consequences can seem unfair or inexplicable. There may be a tendency to attribute them to external factors, other people, circumstances, or bad luck, rather than recognizing the underlying pattern. Yet the connection is there. When emotions are not acknowledged, they do not simply disappear. They influence behavior in subtle but consistent ways. They shape tone, timing, and interpretation. They affect how a person listens, how they respond, and how they make decisions. And because these influences are ongoing, the effects compound over time. Eventually, these patterns begin to reflect back to the individual. This reflection may come in the form of repeated feedback, similar relationship outcomes, or a growing awareness that something is not working. At first, this can be uncomfortable. It challenges the existing narrative and invites a deeper level of self-examination, but it also creates an opportunity. When a person begins to recognize the role of emotional avoidance in their experiences, they can start to shift their approach. This does not mean suddenly becoming fully open or emotionally expressive. It begins with small steps, pausing to notice what is being felt, allowing space for that feeling, and gradually developing the language to express it. It involves building a relationship with one's own internal world rather than turning away from it. As this process unfolds, the ripple effects begin to change. Communication becomes clearer. Reactions become more aligned with actual experience. Relationships have the potential to deepen because they are no longer built on partial expression. The same mechanisms that once created disconnection can begin to support connection. Emotional avoidance may have developed as a way to protect, but it also limits. It narrows the range of experience and constrains the possibilities for growth and connection. When it is recognized and gently addressed, those limitations begin to ease. What once rippled outward as unintended consequences can begin to ripple outward as intentional change, grounded in awareness and authenticity. Blame is often the first response when something goes wrong, especially when the outcome is painful, confusing, or destabilizing. It provides a sense of direction for distress. By locating the cause of discomfort outside oneself, the mind creates a temporary feeling of clarity and protection. If someone else is responsible, then one does not have to confront the more difficult possibility that there may be something within their own patterns, perceptions, or choices that contributed to the situation. In this way, blame can feel stabilizing. It reduces complexity and offers a clear narrative. This happened because of them. But this clarity is often misleading. Blame simplifies what is usually a multifaceted reality. Human interactions, decisions, and outcomes are rarely the result of a single cause. They emerge from a web of behaviors, histories, emotional responses, and unspoken dynamics. When blame becomes the primary lens, it narrows attention to only one part of that web, often overlooking the internal processes that also played a role. This narrowing limits understanding, and without understanding, meaningful change becomes difficult. Responsibility, in contrast, does not seek to assign fault in the same way. It is not about self-condemnation or taking on guilt for everything that has gone wrong. Rather, it is about recognizing one's own participation in the unfolding of events. This participation may be active or passive. It may involve actions taken, actions avoided, boundaries not set, or signals not acknowledged. Responsibility asks a different question than blame. Instead of, "Who is at fault?" it asks, "What was my role, and what can I learn from it?" This shift in perspective is subtle but profound. When a person begins to explore their own role, they move from a position of powerlessness to one of agency. Blame often leaves a person feeling stuck, because if the problem exists entirely outside of them, then the solution does as well. Change depends on others behaving differently, which is something no one can fully control. Responsibility, however, brings the focus back to what is within one's influence. It opens the possibility for adjustment, growth, and different outcomes in the future. This does not mean ignoring or excusing the behavior of others. It is possible to acknowledge harm, set boundaries, and recognize injustice while still engaging in personal responsibility. The two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they often support each other. When a person understands their own patterns more clearly, they are better able to identify what is acceptable and what is not. They can respond more intentionally, rather than reacting MTVKH, привычных защитных механизмов. One of the reasons responsibility can feel difficult is that it often requires facing uncomfortable truths. It may involve recognizing patterns that have been repeated, sometimes unconsciously, across different situations. It may involve acknowledging fears that influence decisions or needs that were not clearly expressed. This kind of reflection can challenge one's self-image. It asks for honesty without the protection of defensiveness. Yet within this discomfort lies the potential for integration. When a person allows themselves to see their own role without excessive judgment, they begin to gather pieces of their experience that were previously fragmented. What once felt confusing or random starts to make sense. Patterns become visible, connections emerge, and with this understanding comes a different kind of stability, one that is not dependent on controlling external factors, but grounded in internal clarity. Responsibility also changes how a person relates to future situations. Instead of approaching new experiences with the same unexamined patterns, there is an opportunity to respond differently. This does not happen all at once. It is a gradual process of noticing, reflecting, and adjusting. But even small shifts can have significant effects over time. A different response in one moment can alter the trajectory of an entire interaction.